I'm very excited and privileged to be here today and sharing this research, which represents the efforts and participation of many individuals, including my colleagues Rena Bivens and Myrna Dawson, who are both out of the country and wish they could be here today. So I do want to acknowledge and thank Crime Prevention Ottawa as well for funding this research and for hosting the event today, as well as the Ottawa Coalition to End Violence Against Women for partnering and supporting both this research and this event. I would like to acknowledge also the space that we are in today here at Ottawa City Hall, here on unceded Algonquin territory, and to thank those who are volunteering their time today, as well as those who care for this building and take care of us and keep things running smoothly. So the title of the movie that we saw the 10-minute clip from is called Cyberbullying, and it's something that we've heard quite a bit about in that form in recent years. As we're here today to talk about sexual violence related to social media, the clip is useful for a couple things to highlight the sexual nature of much bullying first and foremost. As we saw, it briefly shows Caleb, a young man who's experiencing homophobic bullying, and we see that Taylor, despite all that she is currently experiencing, is initially pretty ignorant and unsupportive of Caleb. Now, this movie was received in many different ways. There's certainly many reviews and criticisms surrounding it, and people have importantly raised the point that Taylor, being an attractive, thin, upper middle class, white, able-bodied, and heterosexual, represents only a portion of youth experience. But what this video starts to show us is that the intersections between cyberbullying and sexual violence are quite complicated, and how complicated these issues can be in general. So they involve family, as it was Taylor's brother who initially hacked his sister's account and changed her status. We see her mom trying to sort through parenting issues, how to end this, how to prevent further harm and support her daughter. And we see Taylor becoming increasingly secretive after having her laptop taken away, and this secrecy continues throughout the movie. It involves friendships and peer groups and navigating self-esteem and jealousy and trust and conflict, no straightforward task. And it involves schools, the broader community, and the legal and criminal justice system. So as the film goes on, Taylor becomes more and more isolated from family and friends, subjected to various forms of harassment targeting her sexuality until she attempts suicide. And in the second half of the film, we see her friends and family trying to recover from this and to pursue change involving school officials, police, legislators, and media, with many challenges along the way. And it involves social media, which is rooted in and reinforces language, attitudes, and beliefs. In short, it's social, right? So we see the blurring of offline and online relationships, challenges of anonymity, and the harmful patterns and consequences of slut-shaming in a variety of forms. As individuals and as a community, we can be part of the problem, and we can also be part of the solution. So it is with this in mind that I would like to share with you a bit about our research on sexual violence and social media. So this is an exploratory research project that began in late fall last year, 2012. We had a couple of broad research aims. First, as has been mentioned, we wanted to begin to sort of map out the issues in the territory. What are the connections between sexual violence and social media? What do we know? What don't we know? Although we are focusing here on sexual violence, it is important to note that there is a lot of overlap with other forms of violence, specifically intimate partner violence, including dating violence and other sexual relationships. We also wanted to look at existing prevention efforts related to social media and sexual violence, and to see what was out there for campaigns or initiatives specifically looking at these issues, and to get an idea of any successes and challenges that we might be seeing related to prevention. So overall, this research is very much a starting point, and we hope that it will ignite conversation in order to ask some tough questions and to build multi-voiced conversations about these aspects of preventing sexual violence in our communities. So it's important to note in this research, we're defining sexual violence as any sexual act, attempt to obtain a sexual act, unwanted sexual comments or advances, or acts to traffic, or otherwise directed against a person's sexuality using coercion by any person, regardless of their relationship to the survivors or victims, in any setting, including but not limited to home and work. So this definition has been used and put forward by the World Health Organization and used in multiple arenas, including in international research networks such as the Sexual Violence Research Initiative. It's really important particularly for this research and our discussions today, to understand the multiple and often intersecting forms of violence that occur involving emotional, psychological, and verbal abuse, as well as physical abuse. So the term social media is used quite broadly, and depending on a whole number of factors, including what year we were born in and other things, it may mean different things to you. The chart here lays out 3 of the categories of social media that our current research specifically focuses on, which are part of a larger breakdown presented in a 2012 Government of Canada report. So essentially, we see social network sites such as Facebook, where users can create a public or a semi-public profile to interact with others, video and photo sharing sites such as YouTube, and the rapidly growing Instagram with lots of pictures of food, as many people have seen, or microblogging status update services such as Twitter, which we're making use of here today. Social media sites are widely used. Facebook has somewhere in the neighborhood of 1 billion users worldwide, with about 18 million users in Canada. And recent statistics suggest that Canadians actually watch more video online than any other country in the world. So we're world leaders in that capacity. People of all ages and demographics use social media, but here we are focusing on youth, which we are defining broadly as those ages 12 to 24. Although we recognize that these are relevant to people beyond that. So data suggests that the majority of Canadian teenagers now own or regularly use a computer, with almost 70% using online social networks to some extent, and with close to 50% using them as a regular means of communication. This research involves 4 parts: a literature review, a survey of Ontario stakeholders, interviews with Ottawa-based participants, and a scan of social media sites. I mentioned earlier that one of our research goals was to map out or define sexual violence in this realm of social media. So we took a fairly broad approach, looking at existing research on cyberbullying and harassment, on non-consensual sharing of sexual images, on recording or distributing sexual assault images, and on intimate partner violence, what is often referred to as domestic violence or dating violence. For the last 2 themes that are on the slide, we did not find very much related to social media on these. We looked at sex trafficking and social media, or when people, often women and girls, are forced to provide sexual services against their will. So we didn't find a lot in the literature specifically. And also virtual sexual assault, which can include a range of things from specific online threats to sexually assault an individual, or game-simulated sexual assault in a setting such as a multiplayer video game using characters to sort of gang up on each other. So what did we take away from literature that exists in this area to date? First, like other areas of society, social media sites are spaces where abuse and harassment occur. What we know far less of is how often this abuse or harassment is sexual in nature, how often this abuse targets a person's sexuality or uses threats or intimidation to coerce sexual behavior. So we hear a lot about youth and sharing of sexual images and text messages these days. And there are some studies that looking at this in relation to cyberbullying as well. Now, some research focuses on minors and on sharing of sexual images and nude photos, and legal issues and implications of this related to distribution of child pornography, for example. But other work, and what really is emerging as an important, relevant piece of the conversation when talking about sexual violence specifically, is the non-consensual sharing of photos, or using these photos to intimidate, when photos are shared to humiliate or degrade someone, when they are taken without permission or obtained through coercion. So for example, one survey conducted through social media found that about half of the youth reporting they had sent a nude photo reported that they felt pressure to do so. So we're beginning to have discussions about issues of pressure and consent. Now, while there's limited research available to date surrounding sexual abuse and harassment perpetrated towards survivors of sexual violence that occurs offline, this has recently been the subject of much media attention, as many of you will be aware, stemming from cases such as Rehtaeh Parsons in Nova Scotia or the Steubenville case in the US as a couple of examples. The research suggests that there's low reporting rates. Youth internet safety research conducted in the US has found that youth often do not report unwanted sexual interactions online. We don't know a great deal about why that's the case, but a couple of studies have found reasons that they don't believe that it's a serious enough issue, or they don't believe that it will be taken seriously, or generation gaps in thinking that parents won't really be able to help them in that way. In other work, 78% of teens who had been harassed or embarrassed by their partner online did not tell their parents about the abuse. We know in general that sexual violence is very underreported as well, so it's important to make those links in the context of social media. We're also seeing from literature that abusive relationship patterns may be facilitated or maintained through social media. So just as communication technologies are tools for us to develop and maintain healthy relationships, they can also be used to control or monitor, harass, or intimidate. And as well that gender analysis is needed. So there's not a very large evidence base yet looking at gender and sexuality within cyberbullying, although research is certainly emerging in that area. And we know that research sometimes takes time to catch up to trends. So although some research has argued that social backlash or scorn is disproportionately directed at girls and young women through language such as slut online. This type of harassment, as well as homophobic and transphobic bullying, are very important in the context of social media. So while there's little in terms of formal prevention programming related to sexual violence and social media to date, there are several key areas or themes coming out of the literature. So first, research suggests that prevention should focus on developing knowledge and skills of youth surrounding social media and electronic communication, rather than focusing solely on security and control, such as blocking software or taking away social media for a certain amount of time, for example. Alongside this is research that encourages the development of healthy relationships, rather than simply discouraging abuse. So a lot of research and advocacy work has gone into understanding sexual violence and the need and the idea that it needs to be taken seriously in all forms. And some research is suggesting that cyber harassment and sexual violence online is not yet seen as serious. Emerging research is also starting to link the idea of engaging bystanders to prevent sexual violence, specifically related to social media. So this is, of course, rooted in many other social change efforts, not just sexual violence, but around community responsibility to end drinking and driving, for example. And though we know very little in terms of data about specific ways that bystander intervention can be effective online, some studies are starting to explore conditions where people may be more or less likely to intervene or speak out online. If it's a highly monitored space or a low monitored space, well, who the community is online, for example. And a final theme coming out of the research that will surface again in surveys and in interviews is that both the message and the messenger are important, and that youth-driven initiatives are important to prevention, particularly given the various generation gaps that are often present relating to youth and to social media. So the next part of this research is a survey of Ontario stakeholders that was circulated to community organizations, to resource providers, to frontline workers, research and advocacy networks, and educators in February and March. The participation in this research is really important and so greatly appreciated. Many people that responded to this survey are already very overworked and stretched for time, so I really want to do a general shout out to everyone in Ontario that responded. Thank you. As this slide lays out, our goals of the survey were to collect information about these issues and to explore existing prevention efforts, as well as to get recommendations for developing initiatives. So in total, 187 respondents completed the survey. It provides a rough breakdown of the sectors that respondents came from, although it's very important to note that many respondents would fit into multiple categories. So, as the slide indicates, community resource centers and recreation programs were the largest portion, followed by shelters or family and child services. Community and resource centers at 21% of the respondents, shelters and family and child services at 19% represent the largest categories. We also have sexual assault support services, education institutions, and school boards at around 16 or 17%, violence prevention coalitions and networks, community health centers, and then between 5 and 6% of criminal justice program representatives, Aboriginal Centre, or no affiliation or other for this. The survey, it's important to note, this did not ask youth directly about their experience of sexual violence associated with social media, although this is certainly, I think, going to be an important direction for future research. Respondents were asked about a number of issues, one of which was their awareness of various forms of abuse and sexual violence related to social media that they were aware of occurring in their communities that they work in. So as the slide suggests, close to 80% of respondents were aware of social media being used to control, harass, or stalk a current or former partner. Now, as context for these numbers, it is important to understand that this isn't a general population that we're surveying here, and that many respondents do work in frontline capacities where their work involves hearing about sexual violence and other forms of violence on a daily basis. So these numbers speaking to social media should be understood in that context. Survey responses spoke to the intersecting ways that social media and other electronic technology might be used to control, intimidate, or harass a current or former partner. This quote here reads that abusers have distributed nude images of their former partners, for example. 76% of respondents were aware of posting or sharing of intimate photos or text messages without consent in their communities. Many made the connection of this to unhealthy and abusive relationships, and some noted that youth do not always actually view these relationships as abusive from their experience. So, for example, one respondent commented that young girls do not necessarily view obsessive partners as abusive, despite this escalation. This also applies to less overt photos that get shared or sent around widely. 65% were aware of posting or sharing of sexually harassing or violent texts or images. And along these lines, one respondent commented that when we do presentations in high schools, it's quite alarming how many teen girls get harassed via text message and Facebook. Just over half of respondents were aware of social media use for the sexual exploitation of minors. And as this quote below indicates, these themes of misrepresenting oneself to gain trust was brought up as a theme. So as one respondent said, there appears to be ongoing issues with sexual exploitation of minors through digital images in the form of luring from someone who pretends to be something or someone they're not in order to gain trust and access sexual photos of the victim. So a key theme that we looked at in this survey is the relationship between cyberbullying and sexual violence. And the majority of participants really felt there was a strong relationship that they were seeing, and in particular described cyberbullying as a broad label that can refer to many types of abuse and harassment, including sexual violence. So one respondent made this connection by saying, "I think that sexual violence would be on a continuum of cyberbullying. For example, slut-shaming via social media can be considered sexual harassment." Some other key themes that participants spoke of around cyberbullying were that the sexually violent nature of much cyberbullying is not frequently recognized in wider society. That social media does not cause bullying and sexual violence, but does impact the form that it takes. And that it's really important to recognize that there's a high level of harm associated with cyberbullying and sexual violence. And that consent, power, and control are all related to cyberbullying that is sexual violence. And as a general summary of some survey findings, respondents brought up themes of location tracking, of dissemination of private images and texts, of re-victimization of sexual assault survivors online, and as anonymity in various forms as specific features and challenges of sexual violence related to social media. But what's also very important to note is that respondents frequently made this connection that while social media does perhaps create new forms and understandings of violence, these issues are integrated and woven into broader issues of violence, of power, of harassment among youth and communities more broadly. We're trying to get a sense of what we do and do not know about sexual violence related to social media, about data that exists. And so when asked about the frequency of sexual violence in this context, many respondents expressed that although they believe and they are seeing and they are hearing about it happening regularly, daily basis was used frequently, actual measurement or collection of data is not currently underway. We're not quite there yet. And they identified challenges in this regard in collecting this. For example, as this quote points out, that it's difficult to place a number per se on how often this happens because it is usually tied in with a host of other experiences. So people expressed that they were trying to address this violence but weren't able to sort of keep track of it, didn't have those resources yet. So as this research highlights, the conversation about sexual violence related to social media is still in early stages. And so part of this will need to be thinking about the ways of how best as a community, as researchers, as service providers, to define and measure sexual violence related to social media in an actionable way, a useful way to collect this data. And similar themes came up in relation to prevention programming. So several organizations and service providers mentioned that they have started to have to address media and electronic communication and abuse broadly through incorporating discussions about online safety, for example, into existing programming. But evaluations or measures of effects or successes are still to come, although, as this quote demonstrates, initial efforts in this area are seen as well received by many community members. And teachers in particular were mentioned as speaking to the need for education and resources in this way. So in terms of prevention challenges, resources were mentioned by more than 1/3 of respondents as a challenge to offering prevention related to sexual violence in social media. However, additional challenges mentioned, which are listed on this slide, are often interrelated. So for example, rapidly changing media environments, including social media, leads to an increased need for technology training and for support for program staff and for volunteers. And this also relates to challenges of engaging parents and the need to connect and to collaborate with other individuals and organizations. Respondents spoke to a lack of data to draw from in this area and the need to get the message out to a wider audience. And additionally, some respondents noted obstacles with some current messaging that focuses solely on individual behaviors and spoke to the need to build community responses in this area as well. Survey participants who were located in Ottawa were invited to participate in follow-up interviews. And the purpose of these interviews was to provide participants with an opportunity to elaborate on survey responses and to discuss further prevention of sexual violence related to social media, focusing on youth in Ottawa. So 8 interviews were conducted as part of this research to date, and then based on additional contacts made through this process, a number of additional interviews are being conducted that will be added to the final research product as the feedback and focus groups coming out of the event today. So what I'd like to do here is highlight several themes that we identified from the interviews, building on survey findings, how they expand on them in terms of challenges that need to be addressed. So first, participants identified a need for broader social awareness of sexual violence related to social media. Specifically, some spoke to that youth in particular should be encouraged to report and to seek support if they are experiencing sexual violence and violence more generally online. So, for example, one participant expressed that we need to get this message out, that it is okay to report abuse, even in this medium. It is abuse, it is sexual harassment. To know that it is not something to be dismissed, that it is not something to say, oh, it's okay, it will go away, that education piece of what it is, what it actually is, that it is abuse. And in this regard, several respondents were clear that it is important to communicate with youth and not at youth, and that peer mentoring and one-on-one communication, for example, are important to combine with broader or more mass messaging public education campaigns. Several participants also spoke about online anonymity and cruelty in the context of social media. And while not identifying it as the cause of abuse, but several participants commented that this potential or this partial or this full anonymity and physical distance when online seems to contribute to exaggerated or extreme cruelty in many cases, in addition, of course, to challenges with police investigations and identifying perpetrators as well. So related to this, some participants also spoke to the idea that conflicts among youth seem to be sort of played out through this more public space of social media instead of face-to-face, and that when this happened, they often became magnified or even glamorized. This was brought up in particular when discussing girls' abuse and harassment of other girls, actually, and one participant reflected that girls buy into the same myths that men do around violence and sexual assault and these type of things. I think it can be used as a way to distance themselves from the situation, for example, to think, I'm going to pile on the attack and then it's not going to happen to me. So there was this tension that emerged from the interviews around self-protection and around victim blaming, where Participants felt that youth, in particular girls and young women, should be made aware and provided information about online safety, as well as the permanency or semi-permanent or non-retrievable nature of images shared online, and provided with resources to make informed choices and set their own boundaries around online activity. However, several sort of simultaneously expressed discomfort with this, with putting the onus mostly or solely on girls and young women to prevent violence and harassment online, feeling that this wasn't an ideal situation and certainly not an effective long-term solution to just sort of move the violence and abuse onto another individual and not that particular individual, potentially. One respondent captured this tension by saying, "It is the difference between, hey, young women, this is how you can protect themselves, as opposed to putting the onus on everybody in the online community to start to take responsibility for what they're doing." In addition to promoting youth media literacy, some participants also raised the point that these conversations will need to include discussions about consent. And one participant expressed that informed consent in an online context would definitely be a key piece. The language or the skills to help them figure out in their own minds what are they comfortable doing, helping them establish some boundaries that consent does apply to social media. And two final themes in the interviews here are the importance of engaging parents and bystanders and the need for training and resource development. So some participants noted that parents really do have an important role to play, but they may have varying levels of comfort with social media and with talking about sexual violence with their children, and may therefore feel less comfortable talking with their children about these particular issues. Other participants spoke to the need to engage the broader community in prevention, including online communities and those who might not see themselves as supporting or facilitating abuse, and identifying ways that bystanders could speak up or take action online, not forwarding photos or speaking up to support someone. And training and resource development was also brought up. For example, media and online literacy, anti-homophobia education, and how to support individuals who experience sexual violence in general, as well as specifically related to social media. And so in general, in the interviews, there was sort of a feeling of just, complexity and being overwhelmed by these issues, which I think is really why it's so great to be talking about this and have you all here today to move that forward. And so a final component of this research is a scan of social media as a prevention tool for sexual violence related to social media. And so many sexual violence prevention efforts have moved online and have taken up online components in different ways. There are also many different cyberbullying campaigns and prevention efforts as well. A few campaigns have also surfaced that include a component specifically relating to sexual violence and social media in some way, such as the poster from the Draw the Line campaign that many in this room may have seen, where one of the posters asked the question, "A friend sends you a photo of a naked girl he knows. Is it a big deal to share it with others?" and encourages individuals to figure out where they draw their lines relating to sexual violence in their communities. So these are just some images of a few examples of existing initiatives and campaigns where we can see the intersections of dating abuse and digital dating abuse, cyberbullying, and sexual violence. For example, the image on your left, the Love Is Not Abuse app, is an app that is designed to be a resource for parents and simulates what it calls digital dating violence, and is meant to provide advice about dealing with various situations and having conversations with youth about digital dating violence. Other poster campaigns are beginning to send messages or call-out cards about consent and the sharing of photos, and encouraging people to think about online actions. So we can see the poster in the middle that I believe says, "When you pressure me for nude pics, I throw up in my mouth a little." The two posters on the right are both Ontario-based, so a Facebook image of the Pause Before You Send campaign recently emerged is from the University of Ottawa Student Academic Success Centre, I believe, and the Think campaign originating from the Crime Prevention Council of the Waterloo region that asks individuals to take a variety of steps before they do actions online, thinking about, is it kind, is it necessary, etc. Based on these various components of the research to date in this exploratory study and what we've read and who we've talked to, we offer you today these following 10 recommendations as a starting point to approach preventing sexual violence associated with social media. So first, related to how we understand sexual violence and social media. To approach prevention by recognizing that youth are not a homogeneous group, that their experiences with sexual violence and social media are affected by many factors, including but not limited to gender, experiences of racism, sexual orientation, ability, and mental health, for example. To think about social media as a tool, something that facilitates sexual violence or associated with it. It does not cause it. That's rooted in larger social issues too. 3, to avoid victim blaming in situations involving youth, their sexuality, and sexual exploration. Online safety advice may offer protection in some instances, but it's not a road to prevention. Regarding identifying sexual violence associated with social media, to foster knowledge sharing and collaboration, using the vast expertise of many of those working towards the prevention of cyberbullying and sexual violence prevention more broadly in all these different areas of society that we have here today. 5, to encourage youth and parents to both define and develop healthy relationships generally, as well as in social media contexts. For prevention, number 6, to identify measures that are linked to sexual violence and social media and develop program evaluation strategies to build systematic data in this area. 7, to support and to build youth and parental digital media literacy. 8, to provide opportunities and resources to educators and frontline workers for social media training and for programming, and to use their expertise in this area as well, as we know many have knowledge of social media. 9, to look to social media as a prevention tool and to move beyond simply using offline strategies online, but also to really tap into some of the opportunities there to provide interactive and multi-site programming when possible. And 10, to focus on ground-up approaches, finally, that engage youth in all aspects of prevention programming.
I'm an old guy, and so I have to get things in my context. What is the difference between cyberbullying for youth today and writing in a phone booth or a bathroom stall for a good time call in my day? Or is there a difference at all?
I certainly think there is a difference. I think what we're trying to do is sort of figure out what those are. But, one is certainly the reach of just the sheer number of people, right, that social media can reach in that way. But also the speed at which that can happen, right? That, you can see things in a couple hours go viral online or images shared. What participants also spoke to and respondents of the survey around cyberbullying was just that it's hard to escape it. It sort of follows you home. In that bathroom stall, maybe there's a different bathroom stall you can use where you avoid that bathroom. And yes, people see it, but I think that what we're seeing is there's a lot of images in social media, like whether and it can be, as I mentioned, pictures of food, and people don't describe what their food looks like, they just post a photo of it. And so I think there's something, which is beyond my research expertise, but about images and the power of those and the difficulty in which it can be to escape it. And the way in which this, people are speaking about this re-victimization just kind of going on and then on and then on. It's not sort of you see it once and then you don't see it again. So that's, I think, some perspective and one perspective, but I feel like a lot of people in this room would also have something to contribute to that answer as well.
I'm Jennifer McKenzie. I'm the chair of the school board, and I have 2 questions. One is as in my role as a member of the board, and the other is as a parent and member of the community. My first one is, and I loved your 4 approaches to addressing the issue. They all resonated with me. But one of the things we are doing in our schools is teaching critical thinking and resilience. And I think they very much play a part in this. And I just wondered if your THINK acronym, I think, got to some of that. Mm-hmm. And I just wondered if you could speak to or talk about maybe how you're interacting with the schools and getting some of this into the curriculum. Mm-hmm. My second question is related, because I think they come together, is if you could comment on the sort of pack mentality. One person abusing another person is one thing, but when people sort of pile on, I mean, I'm not a fan of Rob Ford, but if you look at the way he's being treated in the media, there's aspects of that as well. And I just wondered if you could comment on that and if there's any way to address that.
I think you've hit on two, very important sort of gaps in the literature and in the research to date as well, in that, we don't know a lot about how youth are experiencing social media, about, their thoughts and experiences in that way yet. And also in terms of talking to school boards and school-based prevention initiatives as well. The question about Rob Ford gets me thinking too, in conversations about, political attack ads and bullying and adults and just the way in which, I think it's very tempting to say, well, youth are this way and they are mean to each other and are doing this stuff online. But, first of all, they're growing up in this world that we've created for them and people before us have created for us, right? So these are connected to a lot of different things, which I think is an important thing to think about bystanders and modeling behavior and things like that, what everybody can do. And I think, part of it is that youth, are using social media a lot and have grown up with different notions about it. First, I didn't go through high school when social media was around, thank goodness. But at the same time, I think to just say like, well, just don't say that, or don't be in public, or don't have these online relationships to try and prevent, piling on. I think it's a bigger conversation than that. In terms of your question about school boards and programs, I think that would be something that Crime Prevention Ottawa, that Octiva, and that all of us invested in this really want to see happen. It's a big topic, and in exploring it, you kind of realize all these different people that have a role to play and that need to be talked to. At this point, I think that's pretty much a next step. We've heard from some people from school boards and educators in schools in this, but certainly not enough. And then the final point I would make about efforts currently in schools and around cyberbullying and sort of critical thinking and self-resilience is that I think that's so important, and that's often what we talk about with cyberbullying. But I think when we add sexual violence to that conversation, though, that we have to do more, right? And many of people in this room and beyond that work in sexual violence prevention, as well as many others, will know that we've been advocating and pushing for a long time that we can't just tell girls and young women and boys and young men as well how not to get assaulted, but we need to start talking about how not to assault and the broader kind of conversations. So I think that whenever we're talking about youth skills and self-resilience and protect yourself, that we always have to have that in mind.
It occurs to me that it's pertinent to remember how Dalton McGuinty got shot down when he wanted to have better sex education in the schools.
I think that part of what can be uncomfortable about this conversation, but also confusing, is talking about youth and sexuality and sexual exploration. And one of the points that kind of came up again and again in this research is this ideas about sexting, about sharing of sexual images, about consensual sharing of sexual images are conversations certainly that parents and educators and legislators are interested in. But just how important it is to think about consent and about sexual violence and not sort of jump right on to assuming that all sexting is sexual violence. And I think it's, as you point out, it's linked to needing sex education as well.
I wanted to ask a question to draw out anything in your findings, either in the literature review or the survey responses, about the intersection of race and gender, the racialization of sexual violence.
I think the main thing to point out is how little work is currently in that area. And I don't mean work in terms of sort of people's frontline efforts, but the academic research, published reports, things that are going on in that way. We have to be intersectional when we're thinking about this, about the different power and privilege. One thing that some cyberbullying research points to is that offline, and I sometimes involuntarily do air quotes because I think offline and online, when we're talking about this, can be kind of a superficial distinction in some ways because they're so embedded. But that youth that are experiencing bullying and abuse offline and don't have a lot of power, are marginalized in society in many ways, will experience it online as well. And it's not just a question of frequency, I think, but in terms of the impact and the harm associated with it. I think that, someone in the video clip that we saw here, different people have different support networks and different amounts of, I think also when we're talking about self-resilience, we need to keep that in mind, that it's, the network, the social capital, the supports that people have. And so if somebody is already experiencing different kind of systemic violence or economic violence in society, and I think that we're seeing that it can be sort of magnify or exacerbate effects that are happening. But the takeaway for me from this is just really that there's not enough known and being actively done yet that's out there.
In your surveys and in your literature review, I guess with the Ontario stakeholders, if you saw that struggle between the types of legal and social responses that are needed in response to sexual violence in social media. So looking at the debates that are occurring right now, the need for criminalization versus education and awareness, did you see some of those tensions?
We did a little bit. I think that perhaps in a more broader public sample, we perhaps would have seen more. Most of the people we talked to in the survey were focused less on it. It came up in that, if somebody takes a photo of themselves and sends it to someone else and they're underage, issues about child pornography and legislation there. It didn't come up as being put forward as an effective solution. Although we were asking about preventing broadly, and so, I think that people, it seemed like the responses were much more not thinking about criminalization and legislation as something that was going to prevent it, but perhaps something that does indicate if we're taking it seriously, as a social priority. But that it really needs to be approached very, very carefully and thoughtfully in that way.
Do you have any plans to actually engage youth in further aspects of your research?
I certainly hope so, and I think that Crime Prevention Ottawa, as they mentioned, is extremely supportive of that and of wanting to engage youth. I really don't. I don't sort of see, based on the research, how we can move forward too much without doing that to some extent. And respondents really spoke to there's so much information and activity and things that come at us in social media, and so people joke about attention being a limited commodity and being able to do a lot with the time and of people's attention that we have. So I think that will be important there. So this today is the first step. Before that, and so I think everyone invested in this wants to see that happen.
But I'm just wondering if you explore the issue of sexual coercion with the use of social media, because that's what we've seen in our work and what our girls have discussed is, for example, somebody has an image of you and they're threatening to show that to your family or share that to your social network because they understand that there could be serious consequences to you because of that. In order to say get you to continue with a sexual relationship with them, or even to coerce you into a sexual relationship you did not have with them. So it could even be as simple as a photo of you talking to another guy. So I'm just wondering if you explored that earlier today, or if you have stumbled upon research on that.
It does come up and it is mentioned. It really links into the difficulty with not having a lot of systematic sort of data collected around there, right? In that, especially for political clout and things like that, to be able to say there's numbers or these are experiences that we have about them. So I think as we get into this more and more, coercion and consent and intimidation and power, and those are all pieces that start becoming more and more relevant. And when people say, well, why did she take that photo, or why did she let that photo be taken? Where this research makes my mind go is, why are these able to be used to coerce, right? Why what is it about youth and sexuality, about young women, about racialized youth and sexuality that enables this to be so readily used to intimidate or to coerce or to bully, right? So I think that gets into some tough questions and some larger questions, but some important questions. Thank you.